Hi, welcome, and thank you for taking some time to learn a little bit about Cascade. I'm Donna Hamlin, founder of Hamlin Harkins Limited, and this will walk you through a little bit about why we're so eager to use this and share it with other people, especially in today's world where all of the leanings are moving away from actually getting the understanding of the customer or the prospect from the customer or the prospect. With all of the new AI and social media data analytics that are going on, what I see is a terrible mistake when people are interpreting data and inferring from that how people think, when in fact the clear and precise way to do it is to find out from themselves. So I'd like to share a little bit about why this technique works and to show you some examples as we go through. Let's start first with, why do we research at all? If we want to not presume and save ourselves the cost of it, that would be one. And understanding how customers or prospects or stakeholders actually make the decisions is built on really an understanding of their immediate thinking and their long-term thinking. And if we understand that people's decisions are made both from a rational standpoint and an emotional one, then we can slow down a little bit and sort out how much of this in their decision actually comes from one versus the other. Now, if we do research, it does give us insights into when people are excited to engage or committed or they're willing to try, but only the buyer or the prospect can tell us the real truth in this. And the other thing to note is that no research is similar, or not all research is the same, is another way to put it, in that traditional research methods just don't provide the kinds of insights that we can now get if we use the kinds of tools I'm about to share with you. The problem with traditional research is that it doesn't differentiate among products or choices. It doesn't give us some of the subtleties in the relationship among multiple criteria that are being used, and it is often based on rational thinking as opposed to the actions that are done on an emotional basis. One of the issues, of course, is that, unlike Dr. Spock, rational thought alone is not sufficient. Most decisions are made largely on the component of emotions. So to understand the psychology and the logic of people that are your candidates for products or services has to use different approaches so that we can get that mind of the buyer, paraphrasing their psychology, getting the language that they use, and understanding the roots of their logic sets on an emotional pattern. That's tricky. We spent many years developing this technique that we call Cascade so that you can learn from social research methods in psychometrics to figure out what are the real insights that are pulling somebody towards you, your product, your service. Now, wouldn't it be cool if you knew the answer to how your target buyers or people are thinking and the competitors don't? That's where you get your edge. So we like to say that the research that we're doing is really for impact. It's really very much tied to strategy, where you're trying to figure out an opportunity for competitive edge, or you're working on differentiation strategies, or how to put your brand together with a brand promise that's tied to something that's going to carry the emotional loyalty of your product buyers. And it is largely about positioning you and that distinction, using language that's going to cause people to say, I'm in. So we like to call it an unfair competitive advantage. If you have it and somebody else doesn't, it definitely gives you a leg up. And you can see from this that there's a wide array of uses of it. And with any good psychometric tool, the more value you get over across all these different applications means it's robust. And here's an array of companies that have been using it for years with our support and help. And you can see from this that it covers lots of different industries. So it is wide in spectrum. It's also been used in so many different countries that it's wide by cultural divides and any kinds of products and verticals. Now, if we're going to start with this, well, let's talk a little bit about the traditional research first. Most data that you look at is what I call sort of favorable, sort of negative data. Here you can see that it's what I would also call gross trend data. And when everybody's looking at the same data, it doesn't tell you very much. This would be the same problem when you're looking at one-size-fits-all data. When everybody's looking at the same survey data using these traditional methods, you don't get any information to use for your own differentiation. Now here's an example of one where you can see that there was a study done that looked at people's impressions of the fast food companies and how they were positioned as how green or environmentally sensitive they were. And you can see here the data on a traditional scale of 0 to 5. And if I were walking down the halls of McDonald's with this as my score, I wouldn't dare say, ha, 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 we're on top compared to everybody else, because there's no statistical difference among these. They're all within the same range. Another problem with traditional data is that there's this component of what we call positive bias. And here you've got a cartoon of a gentleman who is trying to interview this man. And of course, he's answering in a way he's expecting is right for what the interviewer wants. When you're using some of the traditional methods that you're all probably familiar with, that positive bias is not identifiable. We know we have to overcome that. Here's an example of when we look at the emotional versus the rational. When Lee Iacocca took over and he was trying to figure out campaign strategies for how to advertise and promote the cars, and he did research up the wazoo, and the main factor that kept coming up was safety. Safety. So he did all his campaign work on safety. Well, it turned out that that wasn't the driving factor. What people really wanted to know about was the chrome on the tail fins and how sexy the cars were. And those were all emotional factors, and he fell flat on his face with his campaign because he didn't identify those emotional components. Now here's another example of this where in a classical survey, people were asked, why do you choose the grocery store that you do? And you can see here that there's a expanse of things they answered. Now, if you look at that list, I'm here to tell you that that is what they said. It's the rational answer, but it is not why people choose the grocery store that they do. When you do it with the emotional component, you find out it's the convenience of the location, and then they justify what they buy in that store on these kinds of criteria once they step inside. Another problem with traditional data is it's very hard to anticipate what is not yet in the world. So if you were to predict, using classical studies years ago, that the internet would have created all these new services and things, the data from traditional would not be able to anticipate where people's minds are going on that, attitudes about it, cautions about it. None of that would have been picked up. So let's talk a little bit about Cascade and what the elements are. The three components of them are qualitative and quantitative. So we'll take them one at a time. But the first is the qualitative and the other two are the quantitative. The open-ended with probes is the way we ask questions where we're only asking so that we can listen to what they have to say to us in their own words. So if you take an example like this is a survey that was done taking a look at an IT company in Europe where they were wondering people's reactions to what a good company in this industry would be like. And you notice that it's open. And so the correspondence is simply what that person that's being interviewed says, his or her own words, own language. And then when there's a little pause, you wait and you ask anything else, because oftentimes when people are answering, the first answer is the rational, but when you wait and ask them anything else, they give you more of an emotional one. So here's an example. When people were asked this, you can see on the first column, quality comes up on the top. But when they were asked about it in the probe, which is the anything else, you can see that innovation comes up to the top. So what we're able to do with this kind of data is parse out or separate the rational from the emotional and put it into what's called semantic space, where you look at this on the rational, emotional quadrants for whether it's a positive concept or a negative concept. And you can see here in that upper left-hand corner, you can see quality, you can see customer orientation. The problem with playing with language in that quadrant, if you're doing any marketing or promotion, is that those words are being used by everybody. And we also know that the pull or the draw hasn't to do with the givens or the expectations on the rational side. If you really want to look at how to pull people over or build their loyalty, you want to go up into that right quadrant where you can see innovation and integrity, which by virtue of the words themselves are pretty emotionally loaded. But then you also want to look at the negative sides to see, like you'd think, keep promises as a term would be a positive, but really in the context of the interviews that were conducted, what they were saying was, I wish those darn companies would keep their promises. And we do know that we don't want to do any campaigns or branding around a negative concept, because you get this psychology reaction, which is, I think thou protest too much, and it creates suspicion or a jaded cynicism for the brand rather than playing in that upper right-hand quadrant. Now, what we can do also is look at streams of linkages of concepts. So if you were doing something around customer orientation as your campaign, this chart shows you how to link certain sub-concepts to it so that you can actually write a pithy paragraph that ties all of this together using the logic of the buyer or the prospect, so that when they read it, they say, wow, this company gets me. Well, it does, because we're using their logic on them in a way that they can say, I can connect, I relate. So the advantages with this is that it does uncover the emotional drivers, and it looks at not only the obvious needs, but some of the subtle latent needs that aren't necessarily as clear. We're good at studying that to take a look at it, and it sorts out the desires and the affiliations that people might have with concepts and products. And never once in all the time we've done it have I ever found a study where there wasn't a surprise, something that was just edgy enough that you could work with it. And it identifies the right language to use that people can relate to. One of the big mistakes people do often when they're doing this research is to create language within your own teams that you're using to promote, and then you're foisting it onto a public, and that doesn't work. Now we'll talk about the other two. The first is unbounded fractionation methods. And to talk about that, we have to talk a little bit about scaling, because there's different ways of scaling when we set up those sorts of questions for rating. And to do that, let's talk about the four that exist: nominal, ordinal, interval, and ratio. Nominal is not really much of a rating, but it's a place to start. And you can see here a picture of the jerseys that are thrown out for a team. And it is a place to start in that now you've got a naming convention for when you're watching a game or watching the monitoring of it. If I were to say, I'm tracking 22 or I'm tracking 21, you've got some data that you can use. But if I were to say all the odds stand on one side of the room and all the evens stand on the other side of the room, wouldn't tell you anything, but it is a way of tracking. That's about all it is, though. Now, if you take the next level up, it's called an ordinal scale. And order gives you a little bit more information for your trouble in that it gives you order. It will tell you what comes in first, second, third, and fourth in a ranking convention. So one of my colleagues, when we first started doing this, used to love to tell the story of his track meet finishes when he was in high school in Bedford, Massachusetts, because he loves to say, I want everything about my accomplishments scored on an ordinal scale. It happens to be that he ran his best 4-mile race, and on that day, it was 4 minutes and 11 seconds, I guess. And on that same day, across in the UK, Roger Bannister broke the 1-minute mile barrier. So if they were both ranked on an ordinal scale, they would have had exactly the same rating. Came first. The fact that Roger Bannister would have lapped him around the track, which is no mean feat, is completely missing in that information. So ordinal scales can give you some rank, but it doesn't give you accuracy. Now, interval scales get a little better. It tells you order, but it also has equal increments of distance among the intervals. So if you think about it from a baseball game, we can say that the distance between home and first is exactly the same as home and third. They're equal increments of distance. So you get a little bit more relativity as opposed to the ranking that I just mentioned, where it's first, second, and third, but you don't know what the distance is among those elements. The strongest and the most accurate, precise scale is called a ratio scale. The value of that has the other attributes that we just talked about, but it also starts from a true zero and it's infinite. So any number that I might want to give you, or give you two numbers, 1 through 3, I can always put a number in between it. So I can get very precise in my fractions. I can say between 1 and 2 is 1.5 or 1.75. And because it's endless, you can go as stretched as you need to create a measure of attitudinal change. Now, if you compare a ratio scale, which starts from a true zero, it's unbounded, it's infinitely dense, and look at what's used oftentimes in today's world, which is a Likert scale. Here's one with words. Sometimes it's also 1 to 5. But if you're looking at this, this is a very popular one that you will see. And one of the issues with that is that we assume that those increments are the same and that the complexity of a human being can be scaled on 5 points. If you've ever filled out a survey like this and then you felt like you had to write a qualifying sentence because that didn't really capture where you were going or what you were thinking, that's the weakness in the scale itself. One of the other problems with it is that the people who are analyzing the data typically lump the two positives together, lump the two negatives together, and they throw out the middle. So to the extent that somebody troubled him or herself to fill out the scale and making a difference between very good and good or bad and very bad, you just crunched it into, back again to that earlier comment that I made about favorable or negative. They're gross trends. They've just reduced the data into something even less informational. One other problem with it is what we call the inability to capture data changes or attitudinal changes over time. So let's just take as an example Bin Laden in the early days, when there was starting to be some news coverage about what was going on. If we were to go out and survey people in his native areas using a Likert scale, you'd get a reaction of very good. If you went to the streets of Washington at the same time, you'd get very bad. Now, that's fine, except that time and incidences started happening, which made the notorious nature of what was going on even more anxiety-inducing, more emotionally ridden. You can see all these things that were going on. And when you start to get to that point, if I were to go back, or you were to go back and interview people and say, now what do you think of him in his own area where his followers were, you'd still get on that same scale very good. And in Washington, you'd get very bad. But the fact that the attitudes had gotten extremely more intense in either direction is not captured in that data. So if that's true, and all of these things are happening, you are not able with that scale to get what's called attitude change. It's not accurate. So how do we get around something like that? Imagine too, here's another example of it, of a movie that maybe some of you have seen, in which Bo Derek and Dudley Moore were in it, and the movie was called 10, and the backstory, foundation of it was that he saw her from afar, it got infatuated, was trying to find her, and he was going crazy over it, so he went to a psychologist and he was fantasizing, and the doctor said to him, on a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate her? His answer was 11. He couldn't stay within the bounds of the scale because he was so excited. So when we create scales that bind, we cannot measure extreme attitudes or attitude change. So why they didn't call the movie 11, I don't know, but here's an example of what is the scaling mechanism that works around that. It's called a fractionation scale. It was started many years ago by Warren Torgerson, and he has an academic book that, if you ever want to really read details of this, is Theories and Methods of Scaling. And the way it's set up is that you create a 0, meaning none of something, 10 is average, and then you can let them set their upper limit wherever they like, and then scale relatively against their own scale. So this is an example of a question where we're looking at people's sense of self, where 0 is not important, and then 10 is average, and how important are the following things to you. Now, what happens with scales like this is that people start and they set their upper limit. Let's say they set it at 20 or 25, and they start to scale, and then they start to adjust what they said were the ratings on these things, because one's just a smidge more than another. And so they're starting to give you the refinement of their logic of how these things interrelate. Now, if you think about that and set it aside for a minute, here's an example of some data that was captured using a Likert scale. And it was a satisfaction survey that was conducted by a number of different companies where they share the universal data and then compare themselves to that. And this company came to us and said, there's something wrong with this data. It's about satisfaction in the workplace, but we know, just looking at these, that the scores for Department 1 versus 2 and 3 are wrong, because Department 1 is the group that's the Green Beret team. They come up early in the morning, they work really late, they are passionate, everything's excited, and the other 2 are not as much. And if you look at this data statistically, as it's listed here, all of them are statistically the same. So they had an intuition that something's wrong, and we said, well, let's do it over, and we used the ratio scale. Now you can see where an average score for Department 1 is 37.2, whereas the others are much lower. It's statistically significantly higher for Department 1. And the beauty of this is that when you start comparing that score to what correlates with it, it will tell you what's driving that excitement for Department 1 as opposed to the other 2 departments, which is where you start to get the information you need to figure out what to do. It helps you with the guidance on actions that you can take that help drive change. Using those kinds of techniques gives you much deeper variance. The precision is higher. There is no measurement error in it because it's an unbounded scale, whereas the other scales have 20% or less or more refinement problems just on measurement error alone. And it allows you to predict the decisions that people are going to make in a high incident success rate. Now, let's take it up a notch a little bit more, looking at multidimensional scaling. Most times you may not use this, but to understand it is important. This is an axis that is commonly used when you're doing what's called cluster analysis. If you're sitting around a table and you're all bright, and you've got some great ideas of things that might be part of their branding message strategy, and because you're all intelligent and you all care, you've got too many. And you can't do that in a campaign. Too many just doesn't work for a market. You have to have things that are memorable, which means you need to bring them down. And this technique that is used runs an orthogonal analysis around this to take a look at what becomes clusters of ideas that probably belong together under an umbrella concept. And when you're doing that, you're rotating around the data and you're finding the clusters and then giving them a new label so you can reduce the themes. Now, the problem with doing that comes from an old mythology around Procrustes, who had a magical bed. He loved to have people come visit, but he wanted to make sure that the bed was snug and comfortable for whoever was sleeping there. So if somebody was too short, he had pulleys and slats and he would tighten the bed and make it just cushy for them. But if they were too tall, he'd shave off their feet or their legs to force a fit. And the problem with the kind of data clustering like that is that it forces and moves the relationships among those variables to force that fit. And that violates the integrity of the relationships among those concepts. What we're doing now by looking at multidimensional scaling is to go back to Einstein's theories about relative relationships and not violating the relationships of the data. And the only way to do that is to stop thinking in 2 dimensions or 1 dimension. You have to move every variable that you're talking about into space so that it holds the integrity of the relationships among those variables. And you might think about that as planets in space and where they all relate to each other at the same time. You have to go into multidimension to do it. Or if you wanted to do something a little simpler but flat surface, you could think about a pool table with all the balls, and when you go and strike one of those, it's moving the dynamics of all the other variables, right? So here's an example. And these are teed up oftentimes with the concepts that are tested beforehand, and you get a list of them. So maybe you're testing 12 factors. And it's just an imaginary tool of saying there's a stick in front of you, and on one side of the stick is one thing and on one side is the other, and we could agree that they're not the same thing, right? When the person says yes, then you say, all right, now I'm going to give you pairs of words, and every time I give you that set of words, tell me whether the stick that makes them different is a bigger stick because they're very different, or a smaller stick because they're closer, they're similar. And in this case, it's an airplane and a satellite, and they're 30 units apart. We can agree an airplane and a satellite are not the same thing. Now, if I give you other words, how far apart are they? It doesn't really matter why they think it or what the criteria are they're using. It's their reaction of similarity or difference. Now, here's an example from the study that I was just showing you the peaks on that was done when NASA was trying to develop a program, an educative program, a population publicity program about what they were doing with their space shuttle program, because they knew that they were not capturing the imagination of the American public. They were losing them. And what they wanted to do was get the voter support so that their program could deepen and get better funding and move forward from there. Now, what you see here is on a flat surface, but if you can imagine that all those different topics that were a function of interviews that were done with parents all around the country are the themes that were coming up most often for men and women thinking about the space shuttle program. Every one of those is plotted in space relative to each other. Now, you can imagine that the voter, which is me way up in the corner, is quite far away from the space shuttle program. And so they knew they had a problem. The trick, though, is the math that's used here to find out what to do about it. So if you take a look at the distance between NASA and the voter as a place to start, you can see it's 16.83. They weren't really so interested in NASA as much as they were interested in the identity and the excitement around the space shuttle program, but that's a place to start. Its distance is not a good thing in this case. Then what we do is a form of vector analysis that runs every possible message strategy that should be tied with the voter, or me in this case, and the program to see if you can't forecast a way to move me closer to the identity of NASA or the space shuttle program, as you'll look at in a minute. The first one that comes up is scientific research. The second one that came up was energy development. And the third was new jobs. And while we do every variation possible, those three, when those messages were loaded onto NASA, it shifted and created a little arc for NASA, and that reduced the distance. And you can see there from 12.8, it's gone from 16 to 12.5 almost, which means that you can actually measure how much attitude change you're going to get as a function of your brand message platform. Now, one of the things that's important to know, if you haven't followed what NASA was doing way back then when they were doing the Voyager 1 program, is that they were right because the space shuttle program was even farther away. Look at that, 22.5. And the problem they were having is the campaigns that they were trying to do and the educational programs were foisting onto the American public what excited them about their work. So they were doing all kinds of programs around, wake up in the middle of the night and look at the jet propulsion printout laboratory stuff. Isn't it great to see green cheese on Mars? They were talking like engineers, hoping that all the people who are not engineers would be just as excited about what they're excited. It is projection and not useful for gaining resonance. So running it again with the space shuttle in mind, you can see these three messages: scientific research, energy development, and new jobs. When combined with space shuttle, create a different arc here and reduces it by half, pretty close to half, which in fact was what happened when they shifted and used the message strategy. It was all about the scientific testing that they were doing on board, the whole idea of programs that were going to be tied to energy development, and of course putting teachers and congressmen on space was all about, there are all these things that are going to happen to us, it's for us. It wasn't the campaign around just the engineers' thrills. Now, having said that, given that there was a space shuttle blow up, if you did the test today, you would see a totally different result because safety and government responsibility and heroes would be part of the storyline. We haven't done one in times now, but things have moved on, and so it might have a different shift yet again. But the point is that you can actually measure those attitudinal change over time and tell when there's a shift in a brand message platform, even if it's just one item. So the advantages of doing this are really that you're getting relative values of all the variables, and you understand the linkages among them, and they're so accurate that it will predict over time. And it was originally used a little bit in some social movement campaigns, for political campaigns, on the bottle bill, and Governor Blanchard, when he first was running and he didn't have a snowball's chance in hell, and he won, and he says it's a function of understanding how to use the messages right. So I don't want you to be thinking that it's one tool. It's really three different components of a tool kit. And so if you think in terms of somebody who gets one tool and they go around their house and they're turning screws, and then all of a sudden they run out of screws, so then they go and get a filer and they're putting slots in all the nails so they can keep using the same tool over and over again. It's a flexible set of tools. Many people will start with one or maybe two parts of it and then grow into the third over time. And one thing to understand about this too is that it's critical to the success of sustainability of your brand to use messages and know when to shift, either subtly or boldly, to hold your customers' interest and loyalty and know how they think. And people do change their attitudes over time, either as a function of what they've gotten and then their expectations change, or competitive alternatives that are out there that would cause them to look sideways instead of right at you. So the process is to start with initial interviews within an organization itself to understand the theories of the case, and then review what the plans and the goals are with the history tied to it, and then create a questionnaire protocol that is used to conduct a survey, and then the results are analyzed, all of the permutations on messages are developed, and then the findings are prepared, and there's a discussion with the team on what do we do now that we have a message platform that will help us go forward. So it converts from just results to planning. In mind, I would like you all to be thinking about the fact that we're going to try a little bit of a taste of Cascade on a couple of the client projects that I'm sharing now with the class, with the idea that you get a little experience with it. It's not a big study. Just trying to do an interview using this technique will be interesting and fun, and it won't be overburdensome. It's just going to get you a little toe in the water to understand how these methods work, because they're not anything that you're going to read in your textbooks at all. But it's really good to know it. And I've had one other student in a class from Brazil who went back and used it when he went back to Brazil, and he got a promotion. So I want you to know that it's available and it's cool, and that you'll have a little hike up as you go forward with your own marketing work. So with that in mind, I'd ask you to keep up on your readings, and you're doing great with the homework submissions that are coming in so far. And I'm going to be showing you yet another client video, not this week, but in probably the end of the week, so that you can start thinking. And then the teams will be assigned a little bit of homework on research, for some teams for one customer or client and one for another, so that you will start learning how to apply something like this to come up with some ideas for their marketing as we go forward. So have a great week, and thank you for all the good work.